Hey, Jianggan, how are you?
Hey, Moni, we just moved to a new office.
Oh yeah, how's the new office like?
I've missed it as a better view, so I can see a hotel, a swimming pool, and a few office buildings, and lots of trees. So that probably makes the working life a little bit more conducive. I'll probably end up spending more time in the office because of that.
Yeah, I just heard that you spent 2 weeks traveling Hangzhou and other parts of China. What was that trip like?
So we did another immersion program, right? E-commerce and live commerce, and it was largely Hangzhou with a bit of dose of EU. And personally, I also took a weekend off to the Huangshan Mountains, which was quite nice. I think for Hangzhou, it was the midst of Double 11, first super grateful of all the people who hosted us and who came to exchange with us. But it's also interesting to see, like, to feel people, right? How they talk about competitive dynamics, how they talk about, okay, what they expect of Double 11, and how the e-commerce platforms have to respond to each other because it's still quite competitive.
Yeah, I think it's great that November 11/11 is coming up, Singles Day, the biggest e-commerce day in China. And I think interestingly, some of that culture is also leaking to Southeast Asia as well, right? So we also saw that in Singapore, we see that obviously Lazada and Shopee are both pushing November 11. And also, I think what's interesting is that it also rippled into e-commerce culture where now they do 11/11, then they do promotions on 10/10, 9/9, 8/8, 7/7, 6/6.
And in the last few days, I haven't noticed that many people are doing this payday promotion, and it's end of October. So I've never seen it before, but now I see that with a few platforms and a few Luckin Coffee is doing that as well. So you see their stores, they have this payday promotion, 2 for I can't remember how much, but yeah. So people are just finding ways to stimulate that kind of consumption.
Wait, what is payday celebration?
I don't know. When people started mentioning about payday, I immediately I was like filling in the gaps saying, "Oh, payday loan. Okay, I used to do that in Indonesia, and it was a good business." But I think it's just an excuse for people to launch a promotion because it's just beginning of the month of the 10/10. There's Double 11, and some people just find another excuse to do another promotion in between.
Yeah. So it's amazing. Circling back to Hangzhou is that Hangzhou is famous for its technology sector. For me, I think when I traveled as a teenager, I remember being shown around town by my dad, and he was telling me about the two famous things, which was Dongbo, which is he was very happy to show me about this famous pork dish, which
braised
for those
pork.
who don't know is like a braised pork belly, I think, with
Yes,
Shaoxing wine.
It's very fatty, but the way they braise it and the way that they couple that with the fermented yellow wine, so made it like more palatable. So it's actually a pretty good dish if you cook
Yeah,
it well.
exactly. And I remember they had those like freeze dried or even to go and back then and then also I think we also had like a longjing, which is a dragon tea
Actually,
as well. Yeah.
Actually, also interesting. During our immersion, we had one of the seminars, and we held at the longjing plantation because we said that we want a place where during a break people can actually go out and walk around the plantations, and the temperature was nice. It was like 15 degrees, so it's just very pleasant to walk around. So this guy who was like operating a tractor and was like plucking the leaves and obviously looked like a worker. And I was asking him about how he cared about the tea plantation and stuff. And it turned out he was the owner, and he had been the owner of that for like 60 years. He'd been working on that orchard. Maybe not the right way to say orchard, but he owned a plantation. And he said that hotel you're leasing a conference room from, they leased the whole land from me, and I can tell you the whole thing about how they are doing, how the economy is doing. And I can tell you the whole thing about all the longjing and stuff. We ended up chatting with him for an hour and a half.
Wow, amazing.
And
Never
the
thought
last thing he said is that many of the things that you buy, like the famous longjing in the market, is probably fake because he owns like 12 hectares of land. And longjing is a village, right? So basically all the villagers own different sizes of plantations. He said, I know the exact annual production of what we can do, and I know how much has been sold in the market. Definitely doesn't match.
no, you destroyed my confidence and conviction in my longjing cha stash. Of like this labeling actually happens quite a lot, right? Yeah, right now there's a recent expose. So there's a very famous, obviously, types of durians like Mao Shan Wang. But of course, there's a very even more famous now, which is called Tupai King. And in Singapore, obviously, it's very expensive. It's supposed to be a very rare Malaysian brand. But recently, there's a documentary by Tech Channels News Asia that showed that actually none of the Tupai King is being exported from Malaysia to Singapore. In other words, all of it is currently fake in Singapore. So it's actually quite an interesting dynamic where basically good durian is being mislabeled as great durian in order to get a price premium.
If you start on that topic, there are like loads of things that we can talk about. So a few years ago, we did some due diligence about the supply chain of vegetables and fruit. They were uncovered this whole operation of the Japanese watermelon is sold at a premium, and they're typically small. And there's this whole operation of selecting the smallest watermelon, which basically undergrown watermelon from Malaysia, and polish that, wax it, and put a label as a Japanese watermelon, and they're sold to stores across Singapore and Malaysia.
Wow, that's disappointing. The good news is I never really got into the Japanese fruit, but I don't know, frenzy there.
Yeah, so I think the whole trip to Hangzhou was very fruitful. We also visited a sorting center for e-commerce, and that was a place where 3.5 million parcels were processed daily, and during peak volume it was 8 million parcels. And to put things in perspective, if you believe in statistics from JNT's annual report, the whole of Southeast Asia processes about 40 million a day. And they were there, we were looking at, okay, I can't see the robots. And the guy saying that, yeah, we tried all the robots in 2015 and 2016. It was very nice, and it was very intelligent, and it was error-free. But when you have millions of parcels coming in, they're just not as fast as humans.
That's a good quote. Robots are not as fast as humans.
No, they're not, because they need to move. You've seen the videos that the yellow roundish robot, they take the pallets, they move. And I saw how the humans operated. They were just like through, and I was asking the guy, the sorting center, that all these employees were throwing parcels into different buckets. Apparently error-free, according to him. I said, what's the record? And he said the record was this lady who managed to sort 3,800 parcels in an hour.
Wow, that's crazy.
Wait, that's like more than one per second.
That's a crazy number there. Yeah. Wow.
Yeah. He said at some point when these people become so experienced that they don't even look at the parcel. They're like, the moment that they pick it up from conveyor belt to the moment they throw it at the other side, one of the three buckets, they already scanned enough information in their mind to know which bucket to throw this at.
Yeah, amazing. Obviously, a lot of folks are doing all this e-commerce. How have they been feeling about, obviously, the tightening of trade, like barriers by the Biden administration? Obviously, also experienced the first Trump administration, and now we're coming up on the next US administration.
I think for that, taking back a little bit to, I think in 2016, when Trump was first elected for the first term, I spoke with quite a number of businessmen. At that time, there were already lots of words being thrown saying that, okay, we're going to increase tariff and stuff. So I think in the first year or two, most of the businessmen I spoke to, most of the manufacturing bosses were saying that, he's just making threats to get something exchanged, and he's not going to be serious because there'll be rational forces within the administration which pulls him back. And this is something which, of course, the trade war didn't stop. It escalated. So I think 2018, 2019 is when lots of the export-oriented businesses, especially for some, and I know some doing the textile, doing the bags, doing the stuff, which said, okay, look, we can't sustain this with the tariffs that were being imposed to. So lots of them started moving to Vietnam and Cambodia. That caused that wave to start. And of course, not everybody was successful. Some people went there, they got cheated, usually by other Chinese businessmen, and came back then and started telling people that, okay, it's so hard to do business outside. But there are many people who managed to survive in the industrial parks in Vietnam and Cambodia. Then I think COVID hit. Of course, COVID was big disruptor. So for about a year, and you know that I think that was in 2020 when the last election was taking place. And people were saying that, okay, people were like basically coping with COVID and all the issues. And of course, when Biden was elected, some people had the hope that, okay, he would be more rational compared to Trump. But some more shrewd people I've talked to, they already had the opinion that, okay, so the big direction has been set, right? So it's just whether things will go a predictable and difficult path or an unpredictable path. So that sums up what happened in the last few years about people's sentiment,
Yeah, I think it's really good historical accounting from the Chinese perspective, because I think from the American perspective, it feels like that history has been written as a little bit more clearer from the American perspective, right? Which is, hey, China has been cheating us for a long period of time. And then now this is our chance to make it equal, which of course is quite different from some other parts of the thinking, which is, hey, the American middle class has benefited from Chinese manufacturing. There's a good welfare subsidy to the American lower class as well. It's a good trade. There's a whole that thinking, but I think it's like those two strains of thinking is one is definitely in the ascendancy and one is definitely going down in terms of popularity.
And when Temu was launched, for a few months, there was this voice out there saying that, hey, what Temu is doing is essentially squeezing the Chinese manufacturers to basically subsidize U.S. middle class and the masses. So there was this voice out there. And obviously, so if you look at the whole supply and demand dynamics in China, I think in many industries, there's basically too much competition. So naturally, along the value chain and whoever who controls one part of the value chain, which is less fragmented, will probably have better pricing power, natural. But of course, people's sentiments don't go this way.
Yeah. I think the issue is that the benefits of lower inflation, lower cheap goods, and like mass manufacturing goods for American consumers is distributed across all American consumers. But of course, in America, the Electoral College is focused on the swing states, right? And a lot of them have historically a strong manufacturing base that has had to compete with the Chinese manufacturing overproduction dynamics as well. So not an easy topic. So it's a net transfer of welfare to some extent, at least the intended goal, from all American consumers towards swing state manufacturing. There's I would say.
I think most people I've recently spoken to, most people who are informed would actually prefer a Trump administration compared to a Harris administration, because I think first they had experience dealing with Trump in the first term, and they know that. So when something unpredictable first hits you, you don't know how to respond. But after a while, you learn how to adapt. You see a pattern. I think the problem with what they see in the Harris administration is that they don't know who is really in charge. In a sense that, okay, there's huge establishment behind, which is very stubborn, and which has its own agenda. So I'm not sure whether that refers to the deep state, what other people have been talking about, but they feel that it will be a much more difficult position to maneuver if Harris is in power, or if that whole establishment is in power. So so there is this sentiment, and of course, if you read some of the think tank reports from China, they said that we don't really have a preference, right? So it doesn't really whoever who gets elected, it doesn't really change the big picture. It's just how it's manifested and what kind of distribution of risks, right? I think about 2 weeks ago, there was this forum in Singapore where Minister Mentor, or was it Senior Minister?
Senior Minister, yeah.
Lee Hsien Loong was actually asked this question from the audience and saying that, okay, so who would you, in the current sort of China-US dynamics, who would you prefer to deal with, Harris or Trump? And I think his answer was also consistent with this narrative. Look, whoever who's there, it doesn't change the big picture over the long term. So it's short-term volatility, whether it's higher, whether it's lower. So people have learned to navigate this, and people have formed a sort of perspective about this, and then just take its course. But of course, there are risks which people need to manage.
Yeah, I read the same article and I thought it was quite interesting, because I thought what his perspective was that he felt like the Americans were too bearish on China. Like they felt like their actions in terms of sanctions and technology was too effective. And he basically felt that China would eventually overcome and be able to achieve its like status in the sun and like certain stature. But he also said that he felt like the Chinese side was also too bearish on America. So he said that the Chinese were too pessimistic about America's ability to manage its debt and technology side. And so he was basically saying both sides need to be more optimistic about, or at least more realistic about each other's growth trajectories, that both will continue growing quickly in the foreseeable future.
I think I watched the whole interview, and he was mentioning about the perspectives he heard, usually around his trips to some of the cities and some of the provinces, where he heard from the provincial level or municipal level sort of officials, and many of these officials had a conviction that the US was in a sort of decline, and euros were declining. So if they persisted, if the Chinese side persist enough, then they will prevail. So as you can see, on both sides, there's a lack of trust, there's a lack of understanding of each other, and there's a lack of, I would say that the willingness to understand each other. So look at the international media. How many of them still have journalists stationed in China and to report ordinary stories, all the stories about big strategic Taiwan chip, etc., etc.
Yeah. I think it's definitely not an easy part. I think obviously Singapore is one of the few publications that have it right under Lian He Zao Bao. So they're journalists at the various National Congress and so forth. So it's interesting. You were sharing about the National Congress for this year. There's a lot of decisions to be made. I think a big one is we were waiting for the fiscal policy to come out since the last episode. And it turns out that it's been primarily monetary so far. So I think The Economist has recently reported that the CCP may be waiting for the US election results to come out before they make a decision because they're worried there may be a trade war. So they need to be careful about what kind of stimulus package on the fiscal policy side they want to do and how it's received as well by the US administration. How about you? What do you think?
I think knowing how the government makes decisions in China, especially at the top level, strategic level, so many of the things would have been debated over and over, and different plans and scenarios will be presented to the top leadership. And the question is that, okay, what's the top leadership's preference? And that is a factor of how they judge the market, how they judge the different forces and counter forces will interact and react with each other. So I do think that all the physical considerations have been put in place, and they have a meeting of the National Congress, I think standing committee, between the 4th and 8th of November. And of course, if you look at the timing, right? So the US elections on the 5th, so the results will probably be out on the 6th Asian time. So they still have a few days to I'm not sure how much of discussion that would be, but probably looking at, okay, the different options, which ones they would adopt and to which magnitude. So the more optimistic view I've heard is because if Trump gets elected, there will be a shock to the export-oriented industries in China, and it will be a time to launch a huge stimulus to cushion that. That's the more optimistic view. But the thing is that we don't know. We don't know what's really behind the curtain.
Yeah, it's hard to tell. And I think obviously the concern is that if we do a fiscal policy announcement after the US elections, then people are going to obviously have a reaction, right, from administration. But it could be a good time window to make a move because I think if they made a big fiscal policy announcement before the US election results are done, obviously candidates will jump on it. And it might, I wouldn't say shift the US election as already so neck and neck, 50-50 effectively, but it's hard to tell.
Yeah, and of course, I don't know exactly which are the factors were under consideration and how much weightage each factor was. But if I were the authorities in China, I would not make anything that's too drastic, which swings the public opinion in this election.
Yeah, because otherwise you get blame on one side and you don't get any benefit from the other side from doing it. So it's all bad news. So I think waiting for after the US election is quite key. Yeah.
And also, I'm not sure if you noticed that there was this press conference, I think by the Minister of Finance after the day after the National Day holidays on 8th of October in China, where he practically said nothing. He read from the script and they said lots of things which people already knew. There was some speculation that he was initially planning to say something, but because the stock market was like going too drastic the few days before the National Day holidays, so that they were a bit concerned that, okay, if I send too much optimism into the market, and it will send the stock market to overdrive, and which increases the risk. So I think that there are lots of forces that they have to consider before making or adjusting their policy decisions.
Yeah. I think what's happened also over the past month was really, I think the BRICS, the BRICS summit, right? That was between Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. So I think there were two parts that were quite interesting. Obviously, was the expansion of membership, right? So they added Iran, Egypt, Ethiopia, Saudi Arabia, UAE. So obviously, there's a lot of Middle Eastern countries. They also added Malaysia, Indonesia, Vietnam, and Thailand became partner countries as well. So I thought that was quite an interesting dynamic where Southeast Asia countries are becoming more, I wouldn't say tied, but at least becoming more affiliated with BRICS. Maybe also part of the way to become, I wouldn't say non-aligned because you're already aligned with the US or the kind of all of the free trade agreements. But also I think that was what, not putting all your eggs in one basket, but also putting some eggs in the, hey, free trade with China and Russia basket as well.
I think the war in Ukraine probably changed lots of sort of thinking in a lot of the governments, a lot of decision makers. Of course, I'm not here to argue that who is right, who is wrong, and war is horrible. But I think some of the actions by the West probably eroded some of the confidence that the global South has in international order and ecosystem. So you see all this effort trying to organize some counterweight to G7, G20, or whatever. What I also find interesting about the BRICS summit is the meeting between Xi and Modi, right? So obviously they had good relationships before the pandemic. I think in 2019, was it 2019? Xi was in somewhere in South India, and they visited some places together. And before that, Modi came to China to visit terracotta warriors, and I remember there was a famous like a Wall Street Journal sort of report posting a photo of Modi with 4 terracotta warriors, and the caption said Modi center, as if we couldn't tell that he was the only real person in that photo. But I think since the border skirmish in 2020, the relationship soured a lot. And people talking about India being more aligned with the US, etc., etc. But since the war in Ukraine, that India was trying to find a counterbalance, right? And they were still importing lots of oil from Russia. I think Modi, met Putin somewhere. And then both India and China saying that, okay, we're going to disengage from the border, and Xi and Modi actually met. So you see all these shifts in the international dynamics. And if Trump gets elected, I would foresee probably more of this.
Yeah, I think like you said, the big news was that Modi had a handshake with Xi Jinping at the BRICS summit as well. And like you said, I think part of it is like, I think both sides discussed and agreed that they will have demilitarized some of the areas that they were previously like having contentious struggles with out in the India-China border. So I think it's quite interesting. I think the other part was that there was an announcement, I remember reading about how China is now India's #1 trading partner again. So number 2 is America. So obviously, I think it's part of the dynamics where I think you got to have friendly relations with your #1 trading partner, right? Otherwise, you're putting at risk some of your country's economic growth and the promises that you have to continue growing the economy of India.
I don't think there's quite a lot of potential. I speak with a lot of analysts in the tech sector, lots of like internet companies in India. Actually, quite a few of them came with us for our immersions into China. And they were quite frank. Look, so we are building this thing in India, which nobody has built at this scale before anywhere else apart from China. And of course, you can also learn from the US, but US is such an advanced market. Every piece of infrastructure is advanced. So it's very hard for us to copy directly from the US. So there's lots of exchange of ideas and stuff, which happened a lot before the skirmishes, and since then it has become hard, right? And in Singapore, I have a few friends, Chinese entrepreneurs who used to build businesses in India. So somehow, because of what happened in the last 5 years, they were retreated to Singapore, and they run their small circle, and they're still very passionate about India. One of them stayed in India for 11 years before 2020. And every time I have a friend from India visiting, and he always says, hey, can I join? Because he's still very passionate about India.
Yeah, it's been 2,000 years, right, since the Silk Road happened between India and China, right? So I think trade between India and China is like a fundamental reality, right? It's just a function of proximity, function of two civilizations. So I think that's quite straightforward. I think what's different, of course, is that there's a bit of a trade imbalance, right? So like you said, the Chinese are very interested in exporting to India. And obviously there's a lot of like electronics. I remember talking to a smartphone manufacturer who's exporting a lot of cheap smartphones to India as well. But I think the tricky part is that the India market doesn't feel like they have as much access to the Chinese market, right? So they're mostly exporting like commodities and like more basic items to China. So I think there's a little bit of a trade imbalance, which is I think the reason why, even though the trade relationship is high, I think that's the question mark.
So that goes to the whole big question about, so after China, because the different narratives of what happened when China joined the WTO in 2003, right? And there's one narrative saying that, okay, one thing people know for sure is that all the outsourcing demand from the US, from other countries came to China because low cost, decent educated labor and decent infrastructure, etc. So there's another narrative which I heard recently from a famous scholar in Beijing. He was saying that, look, you think the local governments in China are forward-looking and they build all these industrial parks just in time for all this demand to come in, and they have enough to support infrastructure to support all this manufacturing being built. He argued otherwise. He said, it was the industrial parks were built purely because the local governments tried to make money from the land. And at the local government level, they didn't know all this demand would come in. They didn't know that, okay, the economy would take off. And in fact, the 2 or 3 years before that happened, they were struggling to find ways to make these industrial parks viable. Everything came and all the infrastructure there. So that created a huge manufacturing ecosystem. The question is that when we talk about other countries, planning the industrial parks, planning the clusters, supporting the businesses, not only the manufacturing business per se, but all the upstream businesses, and creating logistic and supply for them. I think very few governments are doing that in an aggressive way that China or the different local governments in China, whether deliberately or unconsciously, subconsciously, and did 20 years ago.
Yeah, I think industrial parks are interesting, but a way to use the land, right? Obviously, I think China was also selling a lot of residential land, right, for real estate developers, and there was an overbuilding of real estate for residential purposes. But of course, for industrial, it's different, right? Because obviously the value is not as high initially, but I think obviously you get commercial taxes on the businesses operating there. And I think Singapore has been doing a lot of work, right? I think Singapore was one of the first few investors, and they helped build the Suzhou industrial park. And the model was replicated a few times after that.
I think Alicia mentioned that in the same interview we were talking about. I personally also think that there's a lot of learning from the Suzhou Industrial Park, because I remember in the early 2000s, there was like lots of like different local government officials would visit the Suzhou Industrial Park, and they would take some of the learnings and they try to adapt it differently in their home counties, their home prefectures, based on the local circumstances. And I think that the impact of Suzhou Industrial Park is probably far beyond what it originally created, and the FDI it directly attracted. I think it had a very big impact to the whole economy and how everything's planned in China.
Yeah, I think a lot of Singaporean entrepreneurs who made money going to Suzhou and building the industrial park and having that combination between, at that time, obviously Chinese had a kind of an emerging workforce, but very young and very hungry. And at the time, obviously Singapore had already climbed up the manufacturing ladder, but didn't have the labor anymore to sustain all that. So Suzhou Industrial Park was a big piece. So I've met many like entrepreneurs who were there, and now they are like retired in Singapore. Also, I think I've also met a lot of people from Suzhou in Singapore as well, because of that historical economic tie, right? That's been interesting to meet them over coffee or dinner. They're like, oh, where are you from? And a lot of them are from Suzhou because they had that prior working relationship with Singaporeans, right? So their parents want to send their kids to Singapore and everything. So it's quite an interesting dynamic for sure.
It is. So I think for the last 30 years, it was different sentence, right? Different kind of, you always believe that the future will be better and you are willing to work hard for that. And now I think for certain parts of society, people feel that they're obliged to work hard, but doesn't necessarily mean the future will be better. So that's the whole nature is about, right? You put extra effort, you don't expect, or you don't generate like a proportional extra return. So how the government will steer people's confidence back, I think that's a big question of all the stimulus and all the stuff. What happened in the stock market before the National Day is testament that there's money in the society, and if for the right stimulus, people are willing to put this money into the right use. Right, of course, purely into the stock market, I'm not sure whether that's the right use.
Yeah, and I think what people also have to remember that Suzhou kind of ties back to what you mentioned about Hangzhou as well, right? Both of them are relatively close to each other. They're near Shanghai, which obviously is the financial hub for China, right? But also I think it has access to all of the coastline in terms of trade and the river rail connectivity as well. So I think there's a superpowered cluster going back to Suzhou, which the industrial park, but also ties back to the Hangzhou like technology cluster, which also ties to the Shanghai stock market as well.
And you know that there's this subtle difference between Suzhou and Hangzhou, or between the two provinces, Jiangsu and Zhejiang, which I think are the two highest provinces in terms of GDP per capita in China. I checked that both provinces was probably about $20,000, like twice the national average. Suzhou started a model where they attract lots of FDI. It's a similar model that Singapore grew its economy, right? So lots of like international companies come, the chip manufacturers, the electronics companies, the software companies, etc. They set up on the base in Suzhou. They acquire land, they do the manufacturing for China, as well as with the port infrastructure in Shanghai and for international markets. And the sector in Hangzhou is a bit different. It's the whole promise of Zhejiang is more sort of a private enterprise driven. You don't really have that many large MNCs investing in that province, but you have lots of clusters forming because of private enterprise and private entrepreneurs. They form clusters and they make things work. Of course, I think the two help each other, but the ecosystem is very different. And sometimes it's hard to explain. When I was back from China, I told some of the entrepreneurs based in Singapore here, saying that, hey, I went to EU, and many of them actually were previously engaged in cross-border trade. And I said, I felt that the EU bosses have a very different vibe compared to Guangzhou and Shenzhen bosses. And then one of them said, Daddy, you are exactly right. I don't know how to describe it, but there's just, we meet them, there's a clear difference, whether this guy's from EU or whether this guy's from Shenzhen.
Wait, I want to hear what's the difference.
I don't know how to describe it, right? I don't know how to describe it. It's just, you meet them, the vibe probably is manifesting what kind of alcohol they drink, what they talk to you about, and what the aura they project, right? It's how exhausted they are, which markets they operate in, and what kind of supporting infrastructure they tap on. They just give you a very different aura. Next time when you have the chance to go to China, just go to both cities, and I'll set you up with a few local bosses, and you will feel the difference. I just don't know how to describe it.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting that you mentioned about the aura, and maybe next time we've got to do one of those trips together as well. Yeah, I think it's interesting, right? Because like you said, I think it actually goes back to your question earlier, which is like GDP per capita, right? So like you said, Suzhou and Hangzhou are about double that of the China national average, which is about 12 to 13,000 GDP per capita.
Yeah.
And then obviously Singapore and USA is around $80,000 to $100,000 GDP per capita, which also goes back to like I said, like every part of China is different from every part of America and Singapore, which is more advanced at each, I think, component. But of course, like you said, the US is a big market. So now you got to figure out whether you go to India, Indonesia, Malaysia, Vietnam as well, which are more similar in terms of GDP per capita. Yeah.
I think when people try to expand the market and obviously so this morning was in the news that Luckin is thinking about expanding to the US. When Chachi, the founder, has been in the US a lot in recent months, and he's trying to crack the US market. I think for a long time, in businesses in China, so consumer brands in China had this fear, right? So US is too advanced a market, and it would be difficult for us to crack. And but when a few people led the way, and look at all these consumer electronics brands, when you look at Temu, etc. So they showed the way that this market, it is possible to build some initial traction in this market. And that inspired a lot more to actually go to the market. I would think that this is healthy, right? It's just China allows US business to access its domestic market and vice versa, and that would probably mitigate some of the bigger risks that the geopolitics will probably entail.
Yeah, and I think it makes sense if you're selling for a cup of coffee in a national GDP per capita is around 12 to 13,000 versus you're going to sell it at 80 to 100,000 GDP per capita. On average, you can charge your coffee or tea 5 times higher, and that's all pure profit.
And there's also one business from China, which recently, I think last week, opened the first outlet in Brooklyn, in New York. And that business is something that doesn't get reported at all. It's a pedicure business, right? Foot massage, electrotherapy, and stuff. And I have not been to any outlet in China myself, but they have grown to be, I don't know, thousands of outlets. And many of my friends have been to one of their outlets. They said, okay, compared to the other chains that you've been to, their training of the employees and in terms of consistency of skills and stuff is pretty good. So they opened a market in Brooklyn. I was asking a few, Chinese friends in New York, and they said, wow, $32 for 50 minutes. That's better than what I'm getting elsewhere in New York.
Yeah, I think it's interesting fact is that obviously in America, there's a lot of Vietnamese people who are doing the pedicure industry in America, which is actually linked to the Vietnam War. Actually, I was discussing that recently with a friend. But basically, I was reading this article where, obviously after the Vietnam War, there was a lot of refugees and they settled in California. And there was an actress called T.P. Hadron. She was basically took charge of a lot of Vietnamese women. And she introduced them to the nail industry because she's a star. She has got nice nails. And so I think the Vietnamese women kind of got trained by her to do nails. And then obviously it boomed from there. So when my wife and I were there in New York, in Boston, in California, and my wife would obviously go to her nail salon and everybody was like a Vietnamese or Vietnamese Chinese person. I think to some extent this industry is also a little bit more Asian by nature. So I think it makes sense as an entry point. And actually, there are other Singaporean consumer brands that are doing the same move from Singapore to the US. I think their perspective is a little bit different, which is that Singapore's GDP per capita is equivalent to America, but the American market is much larger. So they tend not to necessarily go for the cheaper stuff like coffee or pedicures. They actually tend to go for like the affordable luxury tier, which they have successfully done in Singapore. I don't know, like gaming chairs or hardware, something like this. Like there's a bit of a premium image to it, and then they go to the US and then buy a much larger market size for the same equivalent price point. Yeah.
And of course, we even target a niche in the US. There will be a lot of potential for us because it's just such a large market.
Yeah. On that note, I think we should tie things up, and we'll see you next month.
Yeah. Bye.